Why do you think that these stories have been hidden so often and often still are hidden, and how can we highlight and share them? So perhaps if I come back to you, Dr. Lindsay, to start us off.
Okay, thank you. Again, there's many reasons for this, but we've only got an hour. So the first thing to say is, I have to say in Hebrew scripture, there is always the joke, 2 rabbis, 3 opinions. And as well as that being funny, there is something theologically important about that, which is that we think of interpretation as a kind of evolving experience. And when we have interpreters that are male, as we know about knowledge and knowledge production, the way in which we inhabit the world, our own location, our own biases, which we all have, impact the way in which we interpret texts, interpret situations, understand what people have said to us orally. And that's just true. That's the way the world is, and that's okay. And we learn and relearn and become more self-aware and open to other ideas. But this is a process. Given that historically, almost exclusively, the commentators on biblical texts were male, there are many opinions about different stories in the text, but they're all seen through the male eye and perspective. The second thing to say is, and to add to that, actually, I would like to say that in contemporary society, certainly in the States and in Israel, we have many female scholars now, many more than here. The UK is a very, very small Jewish community, and they have written their own biblical commentary. And it's important that we think about commentary as part of the ongoing narrative, right? Jews have written law, that is the Hebrew Bible, and we also have oral law, so that's rabbinic literature. Traditionally, of course, as I said earlier, rabbinic literature was male defined, but now, in more contemporary society, that is not the case. Okay. The second thing to say is that people appropriate a text and then they misappropriate text. And this happens with all texts. This happens just with civil law, criminal law, all types of legal and narrative texts. And often this is to suit their needs, their desires. Again, it may not be malicious. It may not be intentional. But this is the nature of the human being. And I think that countering some of those readings of texts is a very important... I've forgotten the question. What was the question? Oh, yeah. Okay. Right. So texts are exactly that point, right? So they use text for their own benefit. And some of the ways in which the women in biblical texts are described is in a way that suits a certain male agenda. I'm not here to male bash, by the way. I'm just here to talk about the realities of history. And it's wonderful that there were so many commentators, but he has very proto-feminist writings in these rabbinic texts. But there's also, nevertheless, the location from which these interpretations arise. And lastly, I think, as there are in, again, many other walks of life, women getting the vote, women getting university degrees, there's fear, right, of the unknown. What will happen? What will happen if we talk about women in text? What will happen if we talk about powerful women, thoughtful women, bright women, warrior women, right? What will happen? I'm not suggesting there's an answer. There's a multiplicity of answers. But what will that do? And of course, we don't know what that will do. But when one holds the cookies in the cookie jar through history for so long, it becomes very difficult to share those cookies or to pop the jar. And I think that that's something that's happened in all walks of life, and it is true when it comes to scriptural religious texts also.
Thank you. I've seen the commentary that you mentioned, actually, and I was like, oh, I'd love to do one of those for the Christian scriptures as well. It looked amazing. Sofia, could we come to you next, please, to share with us why you think the stories have been and still are often hidden, and how can we highlight and share them?
Yes, of course. So, yeah, I mean, as Lindsay has already said, there are a number of reasons why women's stories have, so often been hidden, and none of those reasons really, can be landed on God or in the Islamic faith with the Prophet Muhammad. Their words are abundant in discussing women, addressing women, responding to women. The problem lies elsewhere. The carrying of faith and the message of God is the burden of the community of the faithful, which is made up of individuals who are in turn at the mercy of a number of other influences. There is the historical and cultural context. We know that Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, who I mentioned earlier, she lamented only a few years after his death. There's an incident that takes place in the Caliphate of Uthman. So this is only the third ruler after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has passed away. And there was some political subterfuge that was going on, and to quell the sort of discontent that was going on, and to sort of bring about a moment of silence to get people to stop and just think, Aisha grabs some hair of the Prophet that she still had and some clothing of his, and she takes it into, she wades into this crowd, and she says, here are still the hair and the clothing of the Prophet. They have not yet disintegrated, and here the community is already sliding back into unacceptable pre-Islamic practices and attitudes. So really, the fear for the religion and the direction in which it went in, and the ways in which, is, as Lindsay says, appropriated or misappropriated, was a fear that began very early on for the community. And on this particular occasion that I've mentioned regarding Aisha, she was talking about political nepotism. But she had also expressed such frustration, for example, when it came to phobic views towards women's menstruation or women's bodies, when that started to sort of re-emerge amongst the community, for example. And there is also, the tragedies of interpretation of sacred texts and who gets to engage them. And again, this has been the purview primarily of male scholars, and as has already been mentioned as well, it's not to say that that they came to the texts with a nefarious intent to marginalize or invisibilize Muslim women or women from within the text and scripture, but that they came restricted and shaped by their own lived experiences, their own cultural contexts, their own political context, and these will have limited their interpretations, and that's and that's not to say that they didn't still come to some profound outcomes and some still very pro-women outcomes and some very gender egalitarian views and interpretations of sacred texts. Of course, those are all there. My own PhD is very much on the basis of a 14th century text by a male scholar who had the foresight to record over 200 statements of Aisha where she was correcting, corroborating, or refuting primarily male companions of the Prophet. So, those things exist, the pro-women gender egalitarian interpretations exist, but we need more. We need more women's interpretive access to the text as well. And so, there has been a shift in this, we have seen more women coming to the text, making demands of the text, asking questions of the text, the rise in literacy and access to higher education, and global networking through the advent of the internet as well has allowed for women to start to have greater access to the tradition, to the Islamic texts, and to ask their questions. But those who have been used to power do not relinquish it so easily. And an egalitarian expression of Islam, would undermine the interests of many who do benefit from a patriarchal expression. So there must be a concerted effort made to support, maintain, and strengthen the positive changes that we are now seeing. Events like today's are essential. We must have forums to promote women's stories and interpretations where, we can critique and interrogate long-standing, unquestioned positions, where we can build alliances. We need to support and encourage academic research and scholarship focused on excavating the stories of women in our tradition and in interrogating the traditions with the needs, questions, and lived experience of women as a guiding probe. And we must amplify one another's voices. I actually met Jenny through an interfaith project on women's veiling in the Abrahamic faiths. And we have since sat on panels together. We have flung ourselves off a church tower and slept rough in a car park to raise money for charity. Jenny has been one of my greatest champions and sister in fighting the patriarchy. So I can only really stress again the importance of events like today's and coalition building, not only within our own faith communities, but beyond as well. And finally, I think as people of faith, it is about being the change that we want to see. So famously in the Quran, we are told that Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change themselves. That's in chapter 13, verse 11 of the Quran. And this is a reminder and a call to our own agency. If we want to see change, we have to embody it, and we must do so with courage. It takes a lot of bravery to be able to stand up and say, this isn't right, to be able to turn around to your own faith community, your siblings in faith, and say, actually, I think we're doing this wrong. And, when there's so much to lose for those who have benefited from the way that it is, it can be difficult to do so. There's a lot for the individual who stands up to lose as well. We want to maintain community. We want to stay in connection and conversation with our community. There is safety in that community. And when you are a community, and I'm speaking, I suppose, more from a UK position, when you are a minority community, and then you as a woman are a minority within a minority, it can be frightening to raise our voices and to say no. But again, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, do not let the fear of people stop a single one of you from speaking the truth. And, I like how the activist Maggie Kuhn said it when she said, speak the truth, even if your voice shakes.
Thank you. Yes, Sofia and I did a women's interfaith charity abseil together off the top of a very tall church tower to raise money for a war child. Maybe that could be our next activity. Next time I see you, we'll all be abseiling off the top of St Ethelburgers. There's a challenge for you all. Thank you, Sofia. I'm going to turn to Dr. Lakshmi again to ask why you think these stories have been and are still hidden, and how we can share them.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, I'll go back to Katha once again. Katha means story. So storytelling, that is basically, it is a religious storytelling in Hinduism, because everything is related to God and goddesses and, priests and all those people who've been learned people. So this is how it happens. It involves professional storytellers who recite religious texts as Puranas. Sometimes they also present it in a singing fashion rather than in a talking way. You can sing a song and then interpret it also in storytelling. So, storytelling is very empowering. This is particularly important for women who, by crafting narratives, own their own stories and lead their audiences through specific experiences and perspectives. The need for women storytellers remains critical. That's why it remains critical. For example, if when my children were born, I also followed the same principles of my father. So I used to teach my children stories. Of course, not what my father told me, whatever was the regular stories that were happening in the current days. It could be maybe the story of a cow and some other animals or something like that. But I remember that all these stories, even today my children remember. My daughter is 40 years, but mom, I still remember your old stories. They tell me that. So that is the effect of storytelling. If you tell stories, it never gets out of the system. That is number one. Secondly, storytelling is empowering. I would also say that today you see the world in what situation. All the men are ruling the country. You can see that in all parts of the world. What if women were ruling? Would it be different? Or would it be more environment friendly? Would it be more empathetic? You know, these are many questions that arise. So we have to also think that can also women become rulers? There are so many countries where only men are ruling. Why not women? This is my first question. Secondly, stories appeal to our senses and our emotions, not only drawing our attention more easily, but also leaving an impact on us as audiences. This makes storytelling powerful in delivering any message. If you deliver a story right, as evidenced throughout history, it might last a lifetime.
I'm just grabbing the mic. I was just thinking, Sophia, about a couple of things you said, and it just reminded me. I think the concept of this constant interpretation, we can see it as when we reflect back, we can be frustrated by it, we can be concerned by the invisibility of women's voices, but I think also there's a positive side to the fact that, again, speaking from the Jewish tradition, that the rabbinic texts were the way they were, which tells you that in every place around the world, you know, we have texts from Morocco, from Poland, from Babylonia, you know, there's something about the fact that it's constant and persistent, and therefore we always commit to interpreting text, and perhaps that's the point. It's an ongoing process, responsive evolution. So there's something magnificent about that, I think. It sort of calls us to do the job because we know that in each of the previous interpretations, in each of the previous interpretations, there was something missing. There wasn't the now, you know, this is me in my historic location, in my geographic location, my societal location, right? So I don't mean me per se, but what do I, whoever the interpreter is, have to add? And the second thing that Sophia specifically brought up was the context of privilege. And I think this is actually really important. It's all very well for me to say here in this beautiful space where I'm invited to be in public as a Jewish person, as a minority. I'm white. I've had an outstanding education. I am able to speak in public. You know, it's okay for me to be able to hold rabbinic authority to account, I have access to texts. I just want to be careful about that. I just want to recognize that. I just want to put that out there. It is not something that everybody has the privilege of. And I'm just tentative about our expectations of, you know, all women around the world who live in very different circumstances.
Thank you. That's such an important point. We have got 10 minutes for questions. I wonder if anyone in the room or online has a question. I can see a hand up already. I'm going to just bring the mic to you. Is that okay? So people can hear you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that sentence about religion not being the playground of men is going to be going around my head for a while. But I think something that we've touched on a few times is whether it's the invisibilization of, you know, the wives of the prophet, women in the early church, you know, women in Jewish history, women in Hindu stories. There's a fear, and I think it's a fear that we see. You know, we have wonderful brothers with us today, but there is a fear from some of the men in our community about acknowledging the role of women as interpreters and transmitters of religious teachings. And, you know, I'm personally very excited about how social media, despite all its kind of ugly sides, is helping disrupt by, you know, bringing women educators and scholars to the fore, and also kind of disrupting some of those privilege dynamics, because women in different places who maybe wouldn't have had voices before have been able to speak. But I guess my question is, how do we support, and maybe this is a question we can come back to with our male panelists later, our male peers in sort of challenging this fear of what will happen when we allow women to speak and teach?
Is there anyone who would like to answer that first? Yeah?
I can just say that, again, from my very privileged position, I'm now a research fellow at the London School of Jewish Studies, but I was teaching there for 25 years, and I taught Talmudic literature and Satz rabbinic literature and biblical literature, and my boss for many of those years was a male rabbi, and he took it upon himself to work extremely hard to both encourage me, support me during my PhD, which was also about questioning authority, male authority specifically, and also to advertise the classes that I was giving, which were interpretive classes on narrative. So I think that you can find those spaces, well, you hopefully can find those spaces, and when you find them, use them.
I'll just ask if any of our other panelists want to answer that before I take another question.
Yeah, can I add to that, Jenny? I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes. Okay,
yeah,
yes.
go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, and this is where I'm really kicking myself again for not actually being able to be with you in person, because I'd love to hear from your panel that you've got going on later on. But I think my question would be, what are the men's fears? What is the fear that they actually have? Like, so can we interrogate that a little bit more? And I wonder if at some level there is a fear that if women attain the same position as men have had, the privileged position that men have had when it's come to speaking on behalf of and interpreting the tradition, will men get treated the way women have historically? And I wonder if that is at the core of some of their fear. And if so, I think that speaks to an acknowledgement somewhere, even if just subconsciously, of the injustice that has been meted out against women. And like Lindsay, I also have had very supportive male Muslim scholars. One of my PhD supervisors, Dr. Taj al-Islam, I mean, his name says it, he's a Muslim man, and a great advocate for my work. The book that I have recently published, A Treasury of Aisha, that I was commissioned by a Muslim man to write that book. He approached me from Kube Publishing, asking me to write this book. So there's no lack of Muslim men. It's just there's not enough yet. Not enough yet to build the sort of the sort of momentum that we need to bring about the swing that we want to see. However, I think there's also, you know, I often reflect on this myself, and I think that there's nothing more perfect than God's timing. And at the same time, I also know that God's conception of time is not like my conception of time. So I want gender egalitarian professions of Islam yesterday. I want, you know, everyone to live in absolute peace, safety, security, with their full agency intact and their full humanity intact yesterday. But it's happening on God's time. And that time is perfect. And it is our duty, you know, for me, again, you know, speaking as a Muslim, that's my responsibility as a vice regent of God. You know, Allah talks about creating human beings as Khalifatullah ala al-ard, so the vice regents of God upon earth. It is our duty, this is part of our responsibility to correct this very human wrong. And And again, you know, you mentioned at the very beginning, Jenny, about the Islam and gender read-alongs that I set up over the pandemic. So during the pandemic, during the lockdown, I thought to myself, oh, you know, one of the things that I keep getting told by Muslim women is that all of the texts that I recommend for them to read by Muslim female scholars are inaccessible to them. They're just really difficult. The language is too academic, and the idea, you know, it becomes too obtuse, and they often just give up. You know, they go in with good intentions, but they just cannot get through these books. So I thought, you know what, I've got time on my hands. Everybody else does too. Let's set up a read along. We'll select a book. We'll read it chapter by chapter. We'll meet on a Sunday to discuss each chapter until we finish the book. And there you go. We'll have read, you know, people will have accessed the book, and I would have helped them through that. I thought I would get maybe 10 or 15 people to sign up. I'd have a 50% dropout rate. I expected to have about 5 or 7 people at the end of the session. We are now 3 years since that the first read along started. We are over 100 people still subscribed. That very first post that I put on Instagram, and you know, the questioner, you're absolutely right, social media, despite its ills, has opened up so many opportunities. It has, if we want to use the word, democratized the landscape a little. It really has. You know, when I posted that Instagram post, you know, saying, hey, anybody want to read, you know, Believing Women in Islam by Asma Barlas, 15 minutes later, it was oversubscribed. I didn't expect that. So, you know, sometimes I think there's more change than we realize. Change is happening. It's going on God's timing. And we just have to, you know, we have to put in the work, and the outcome will come when it comes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jenny. And thank you very much to all the panelists. Just a little bit of rounding up. I did like what you said, Lindsay, about, you know, women becoming more invisible in some orthodox sort of religions. I'm not saying particular one, but yes, they are becoming more invisible. Yeah, so there is that invisibility. And then there's also, Sofia, you mentioned that the Prophet's wife, Khadija, gave the right advice and the wisdom for the Prophet to go forward. And Lakshmi, you said that stories are very, very important, and that they're very important to talk about these stories to young children, and they remember them. And I think it's very important for us as brothers or sisters or parents or grandparents to make sure that we tell these stories to young children about women, significant women in our scriptures, that they remember. It's in them from a very young age that, yes, men and women in various religions. And I think, Sofia, if you want change, you need to be the change. And to be the change, you first have to, as I said, you have to work on yourself to become self-empowered before you can make the change outside. And Lindsay, you said about we are in a very privileged position, all of the women here, because we are able to access our scriptures, we're able to be on a platform where we can have our voices heard. So therefore, I think it's very important for us to be the voice for the voiceless as well. And can I ask all of you to please put your hands together and thank Dr. Lindsay, Dr. Sofia, and Dr. Lakshmi. Thank you.